فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to return back to our discussion of 1926 in the chapter of Maryam. And in this chapter, as we recall, there was a command, and this voice, this mysterious voice, whether that be of the angel Jibril or Gabriel or that of Jesus Isa himself, says, وَكُلِي وَاشْرَبِي وَقَرِّي عَيْنًا. And it says, so eat, drink, and be glad. And then the second half of the verse is what we're going to cover today. And it says, وَإِمَّا تَرْيَنَّ مِنَ الْبَشَرِ أَحَدًا فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. So the second part of the verse commands and says, and say to anyone you may see, I have vowed to the Lord of mercy to abstain from conversation, and I will not talk to anyone today. So this is a fascinating statement. First, you have this mysterious voice, and some of the commentators and modern scholars, they talk about this chapter of Maryam as one of being a mystery. So the mystery intrigues the reader and the listener. And one of the mysteries here is, what is this voice? And this mysterious voice speaking to her and commanding her what to do. After this voice tells her that she should drink, that she should eat, and she should be glad, it tells her what she should do next. That she should take a vow of silence and avoid conversing with people, not talk to anyone in that particular day. So a couple of things emerge in the second half of the verse. The first one is this idea of Rahman. And one of the things that's fascinating about this chapter, the chapter of Surat Maryam, is that the name of God is mentioned 16 times as Ar-Rahman, as the most merciful. So Maryam often implores God for refuge, and also other characters throughout the chapter also implore God, but they reference God with Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. And as we discussed, this is a chapter that emerges in the late Meccan era, where the Prophet Muhammad and his companions were going through a difficult, trying time. So they often sought refuge in the Lord of mercy. So let's go just a couple of verses earlier in verse 18 in Surat Maryam, where she says, قَالَتْ إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ إِن كُنْتَ تَقِيًّا. So as we recall, when this mysterious figure emerges, when this man comes, she doesn't immediately recognize him as an angel. So what does she say? She says, قَالَتْ إِنِّي أَعُوذُ. She says, I seek refuge in the Rahman, in the God who is most merciful, from you if you are mindful of God. So she's afraid and she's scared. And because she's in this emotional state, she seeks refuge, not from any person, but God who is seen as the most merciful and the source of mercy. And as we know in the Quran, every single chapter except for one starts with the idea of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, the one who is the source of mercy and compassion. And we see later in the chapter as well, we see this idea of mercy. So towards the end of the chapter of Maryam, it says, يَوْمَ نَحْشُرُ الْمُتَّقِينَ إِلَى الرَّحْمَنِ وَفْدًا. So it says that on the day of judgment, we will bring together the muttaqeen, those people who are righteous, those people who are mindful, conscious of God. And what will they do? They will go to Ar-Rahman. Right? They will go to the one who is merciful, the source of mercy, and they'll go in honored delegations. To the people who are righteous, then they will be together. They won't be standing individually and by themselves and held accountable. So one of the amazing things in this chapter is how many times the word Ar-Rahman is used. And it starts from the beginning of the chapter all the way until the end. Now, the second thing that's striking in this verse is after she's told that she needs to take a vow of silence, that she's told that she's not supposed to speak to anyone else. And here the word som is used. And in a previous podcast, especially talking about Ramadan, I talk about this word of som, of fasting, or literally of abstaining. And this is a word that Muslims frequently use to discuss the literal fasting. Fasting from food, drink, and sexual relationships within the month of Ramadan. But here the word som is used in the more literal meaning of abstaining. And abstaining from what? Abstaining from speech. And this was an act in the Near East that people would sometimes take these vows of silence. And this reminds us of earlier in the chapter where Zechariah is also told that he needs to take a vow of silence. And this is part of his sign for the coming of Yahya or John. Now, if we go a couple of verses earlier, we see that this word of speech emerges. قَالَ رَبِّي اجْعَلْ لِي آيَةً قَالَ آيَتُكَ أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسَ ثَلَاثَ لَيَالٍ سَوِيًّا. So remember in the beginning of the chapter with Zechariah, he calls out to his Lord and he says, I am old, my hair is white, my bones are brittle. Give me a sign that this is actually going to happen, that I'm going to actually have a child. So God responds, the divine voice in the Quran, and says, do not speak to anyone for 3 nights. Right? So once again, this idea of fasting or abstaining or a vow of silence emerges. And then this same word, kallama, is used once again later. It's used when we're speaking about Maryam. So she's told that فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمِ صَوْمًا فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ النَّاسَ إِنْسِيًا. And don't speak to anyone today. So both Zechariah and Maryam are told not to speak to anyone. And the same actually word is used. Now we see that this word also emerges with the speech of Jesus, of Isa. And later when Maryam, as we'll discuss, goes to her people, they start hurling scorns at her and start mocking her and saying, how is this possible, Maryam? You come from a good family. We expect more from you. You had a child out of wedlock. And she has made this vow of silence, that she can't speak, that she can't respond. She can't refute the accusations that people are saying of her. So what does she do in this moment? فَأَشَارَتْ إِلَيْهِ. So then she points to her baby, Isa, Jesus. And they say, قَالُوا كَيْفَ نُكَلِّمُ مَنْ كَانَ فِي مَهْدِ صَبِيًّا. And they say, how can we speak with a child who's in their cradle as a little infant, right? And all of a sudden, that's the moment where Jesus begins to speak, defends his mother, talks about how he's a servant of God, and how he will live and die and be in a state of righteousness. So we see in this particular section of the verse 26 that the idea of speech emerged, that this idea of kallama connects Maryam with that of Zechariah earlier, who's also told not to speak, but also connects her with her son, Isa, who actually begins to speak. And we see here an important theme of silence and speech emerge, that when someone in the beginning, Zechariah, he speaks out, he prays to God, and he calls out, فَنَادَ خَفِيًّا, right? And he calls out in a way that is private. And then his prayer is answered, and then he becomes silent. And similarly, in the same way, Maryam, that when this mysterious figure emerges, she's afraid, she speaks out, she tells this figure to stay away. The angel identifies himself and says, I'm here to tell you the good news of a child. Then she asks, how is this possible? And no man has ever touched her. And then the angel responds and says, this is the will of God. Now, when she goes in the state of labor, she also calls out, similar in a state of weakness to Zechariah, and she says, I wish I had died, I wish I had been forgotten. And then she later gives birth. And when she's in this state of birth and then labor, she's told that she needs to be silent. And when she goes back to her people, she should not speak. And her silence in many ways leads to the speech of Jesus. So to conclude, we see several themes emerge in the second half of verse 26. The first part talks about the idea of eating and drinking, idea of being glad, and how it connects Maryam to other prophetic figures and other Quranic ones, such as the mother of Moses, Musa, where she's told to be in a state of gladness as well, that when she sees her son Musa and Moses. It also represents this paradise, this image of going to heaven, of eating and drinking and being a state of bliss. But then the second half transitions and tells her what to do when she encounters her people. And when she encounters her people, she's supposed to not talk to anyone. Now, in the second half, we see the concept of mercy, that God is merciful. And this is something that I often emphasize when I teach and talk to my students about why does the Quran constantly emphasize the idea of mercy in the various beginning of chapters and the various surahs. And we see that this idea of mercy is connected to God being all-powerful, Qawiyul Aziz, that he's powerful and mighty. Now, if you believe that God is mighty and strong, then you might have this conception of fearing God, of being in awe of God. But someone who is strong and powerful is someone that you may not actually go to ask for help. You may be intimidated. You may not want to approach them. And because you're in a state of intimidation, then you will avoid them, even though they may be able to help you. But this idea of mercy gives a sense that someone has power, has strength, but then has the capacity to be benevolent, kind, and forgiving. So this idea of Ar-Rahman constantly emerges, especially in this late Meccan era, where this community was feeling powerless and desperate. And because they were in this state, they were praying to God and praying to the most merciful. We see also the idea of speech. The speech is seen as an act of power. People can pray. Prayer is seen as an act of asking for what you need. And people pray constantly to God. And we see here in this chapter the idea of prayer with Zechariah and then with Maryam, where they call out and they ask for what they need, they express their emotions. But then there's also value in silence, that not speaking, just being in a state of contemplation or reflection, is a space where someone gets the opportunity to understand themselves and those around them in a more deeper and spiritual way. And when they're in the state of silence, they want to respond. They want to refute. They want to respond to those adversaries and those people who mock them. But oftentimes it's better to be silent, because in that state of silence, others will speak up and defend you, and they often will be heard more or be given more credibility. And we see that in the ending, or towards the ending of the story of Maryam, that when she returns back to her people, instead of actually speaking, she points to her child, and this child begins to speak and defend his mother. So thanks so much once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. So happy to see that my book now is available for pre-order. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to this podcast and share it with others. Feel free to email me or text me about your thoughts, ideas regarding the podcast and where to take it. Please review this podcast. Let me know how I'm doing, any ideas, suggestions. You can visit my website and join my newsletter. We'll be learning more about the launch of the book, The Islamic Mary, its various events, speaking, and promotion. Thanks once again, and take care.